December 26, 1944. George S. Patton's 4th Armored Division smashed through the German encirclement at Bastogne. The lead tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion rolled into the devastated Belgian town at 4:45 p.m., breaking the siege that had held 18,000 American paratroopers trapped for 7 days. Patton stood at his headquarters 30 miles south, waiting for the radio confirmation he already knew was coming. He had done the impossible. He had turned 3 full divisions 90 degrees north in the middle of winter, marched them 100 miles through ice and snow, and relieved Bastogne in exactly 72 hours, just as he had promised Eisenhower at the Verdun conference 3 days earlier. Patton allowed himself a rare smile. Within 6 hours, newspaper correspondents across Europe would be writing stories that made Patton sound like a military god. Within 24 hours, Eisenhower would realize his most aggressive general had just overshadowed him at the most critical moment of the war. Within 48 hours, the command structure of the European theater would begin fracturing along a fault line that couldn't be repaired. Within 10 months, Eisenhower would remove Patton from command, ending the career of the general who had just saved the Battle of the Bulge. To understand how Patton's greatest victory became his career death sentence, you need to understand what happened at Verdun on December 19, 1944. 3 days after Hitler's surprise offensive smashed into American lines in the Ardennes, Eisenhower called an emergency conference at a French barracks in Verdun. The situation was catastrophic. Over 200,000 German troops had punched through weak American positions defended by just 80,000 men. The Germans had created a bulge 60 miles deep and 50 miles wide in the Allied lines. They had surrounded the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. They were driving toward the Meuse River and the massive Allied supply depot at Antwerp. If they reached Antwerp, the entire Allied advance would collapse. Eisenhower's broad front strategy, his careful, methodical push across Western Europe, was disintegrating in the snow and fog of the Ardennes. The Supreme Commander needed someone who could move fast, hit hard, and stop caring about proper military procedure. He needed Patton. The generals filed into the cold conference room at Verdun on the morning of December 19th. Bradley was there, looking exhausted and defensive. Devers, Tedder, and several corps commanders took their seats. Patton walked in wearing a freshly pressed uniform and polished boots, looking like he was heading to a parade rather than a crisis meeting. Eisenhower later remembered being struck by Patton's confidence when everyone else looked worried. Eisenhower opened the meeting by describing the German breakthrough. He used phrases like serious situation and significant challenge. Patton interrupted him. "Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris, then we'll really cut them off and chew them up." The room went silent. Other generals stared at Patton like he had lost his mind. The Germans were winning, American soldiers were dying by the thousands, and Patton was talking about letting them advance further? Eisenhower ignored the outburst and asked the critical question. When could Patton attack north to relieve the pressure on the collapsing American front? Patton had anticipated the question. He had already worked out 3 different contingency plans with his staff before leaving for Verdun. He looked Eisenhower in the eye and said, "On December 22nd, with 3 divisions." The other generals laughed, not because they thought Patton was joking, but because what he was proposing was physically impossible. Patton's Third Army was 100 miles south of Bastogne, fully engaged in offensive operations against the Siegfried Line facing east. To attack north toward Bastogne, Patton would have to disengage 3 divisions from active combat, turn them 90 degrees north, march them through winter weather on icy roads, and launch a coordinated attack against the German southern flank, all in 72 hours. No army had ever executed such a maneuver that quickly. The logistics alone would be a nightmare.
Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, communication lines, everything would have to be rerouted and reorganized in 3 days. Bradley spoke up and said Patton was being ridiculous. Even Eisenhower looked skeptical. He told Patton to be serious. When could he realistically attack?
Patton didn't smile or raise his voice. He simply repeated, December 22nd with 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. We'll hit them hard and we'll break through to Bastogne. Eisenhower studied Patton's face, looking for doubt or bravado. He found neither. Patton had already committed to the timeline before walking into the conference room. But the real hero of the Battle of the Bulge wasn't going to be the Supreme Commander who had been caught by surprise. It was going to be the aggressive subordinate who promised the impossible and then delivered. Patton left Verdun and drove through the snow back to his headquarters in Luxembourg. He arrived after midnight and found his staff waiting with detailed maps and movement orders already prepared. Patton's chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, had worked with 3 corps commanders to plan the entire operation before Patton returned from Verdun. They knew Patton would promise Eisenhower an attack in 72 hours, so they made sure it was possible. On December 20th, 3 entire divisions began disengaging from their positions facing Germany and turning north. Over 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies started moving. The 4th Armored Division under General Hugh Gaffey led the way. Behind them came the 26th Infantry Division and the 80th Infantry Division. They marched through snow, ice, and freezing fog. Tank treads slipped on icy roads. Trucks skidded off embankments. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and whatever else they could find to avoid frostbite. Patton drove up and down the columns in his jeep, shouting encouragement and threats in equal measure. He told one stalled tank commander, "Get your ass moving or I'll find someone who can." The column kept moving. On December 22nd, exactly when Patton had promised, the 4th Armored Division attacked north toward Bastogne. They hit German positions with overwhelming violence. Patton had no interest in careful tactics or minimizing casualties. He wanted speed and momentum. "Drive like hell," he told his tank commanders. The 4th Armored covered 20 miles in 2 days of constant fighting. They smashed through 4 German defensive lines. They bypassed strong points and kept pushing north. Behind them, the 26th and 80th Divisions widened the corridor and protected the flanks. Inside Bastogne, the 101st Airborne and attached units had been surrounded since December 20th. Over 18,000 American troops held a perimeter against constant German attacks. They were running out of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender ultimatum to the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe. His one-word response became famous: nuts. The surrounded Americans would hold, but they needed relief soon or they would be overrun. Patton knew it. On December 25th, Christmas Day, Patton pushed his commanders to move faster. He didn't care that the men were exhausted. He didn't care that tanks were breaking down from constant operation in freezing weather. He told General Gaffey, "There are 18,000 Americans surrounded at Bastogne. I don't care how tired your men are. Move." At 4:45 p.m. on December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored's 37th Tank Battalion broke through the German encirclement and entered Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the lead tank column, radioed back to division headquarters, "We're in." Patton received the message at his headquarters and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Then he ordered the offensive to continue. Relieving Bastogne was just the beginning. Now he wanted to drive deep into the German Bulge and cut off the entire offensive. That's when the real problem began. Eisenhower had been at his headquarters in Versailles monitoring the battle when news of Bastogne's relief arrived. He sent congratulations to Patton. He praised the Third Army's remarkable achievement. He told his staff that Patton had performed brilliantly. But privately, Eisenhower understood what had just happened. His most difficult subordinate had just proven that aggressive action could achieve in 1 week what Eisenhower's careful broad front strategy had failed to prevent. The German offensive had broken through because Eisenhower had spread his forces thin, maintaining pressure across the entire front, rather than concentrating power for breakthrough operations. It was the cautious approach, the safe approach, the approach that let 29 German divisions achieve complete surprise and create a 60-mile deep bulge in American lines. Then Patton showed what focused aggressive action could accomplish. Turn 3 divisions, march 100 miles, relieve a surrounded garrison, all in 1 week. The contrast was impossible to ignore. American newspaper correspondents who had covered the Verdun conference now wrote stories about Patton's miracle at Bastogne. Time magazine prepared a cover story. The New York Times ran a front-page article calling it one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in history.
Every story mentioned that Patton had promised the impossible and delivered exactly on schedule. Every story implied that Patton's aggressive leadership had saved the battle that Eisenhower's cautious strategy had nearly lost. Eisenhower read the press coverage and understood the subtext. He was being compared to his subordinate, and the comparison wasn't favorable. At Bradley's headquarters, the atmosphere was even more bitter. Bradley had watched Montgomery take command of 2 American armies north of the Bulge. Now he was watching Patton steal the spotlight for the American counterattack. Bradley felt squeezed between British arrogance and Patton's showmanship. He told his staff that someone needed to remember who was actually in command of American forces. That someone was supposed to be Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group. But nobody was writing stories about Bradley's leadership. They were writing about Montgomery's organization in the north and Patton's breakthrough in the south. Bradley was becoming invisible in his own command. Patton knew exactly what he was doing. He had spent his entire career cultivating a public image as America's most aggressive warrior. The pearl-handled pistols, the profanity, the theatrical speeches to his troops, all of it was carefully designed to create a larger-than-life persona. Bastogne was his masterpiece, the perfect story of American audacity and determination. And Patton made sure every war correspondent in Europe knew the details. He held press briefings at his headquarters. He gave interviews describing the 90-degree turn and the forced march through winter weather. He made it sound like the Third Army had accomplished something no other army could have done, which, to be fair, was probably true. But Eisenhower didn't need Patton reminding everyone of that fact. By early January 1945, the German offensive was clearly defeated. The Bulge was being compressed from north and south. German forces were retreating back toward the Siegfried Line, leaving behind thousands of destroyed vehicles and tens of thousands of casualties. The crisis was over. The Allies had won the largest battle on the Western Front. But the internal tensions in the Allied command were just beginning to surface. On January 7th, Montgomery held his disastrous press conference. He implied that British leadership had saved the Americans in the north, while barely acknowledging Patton's relief of Bastogne. The press conference nearly destroyed the Allied command structure. Bradley threatened to resign. Churchill had to intervene. Eisenhower spent 2 weeks managing the political fallout. And through it all, Patton kept driving his Third Army forward, achieving gains while everyone else was dealing with hurt feelings and wounded pride. Patton's success was becoming Eisenhower's problem. Every time Patton won a victory, it raised the question why Eisenhower wasn't giving him more freedom to operate. Every time Patton captured territory, it validated his aggressive single-thrust strategy over Eisenhower's broad front approach. Every time Patton appeared in newspapers, it reminded the American public that the real fighting general was a subordinate, not the supreme commander. Eisenhower was trapped. He needed Patton's aggressive combat leadership to win the war, but he also needed to maintain his own authority and prevent Patton from becoming a political threat. The situation was manageable as long as they were fighting Germany. Once the war ended, the problem would become acute. Patton understood the dynamic perfectly. He wrote in his diary in January 1945, "Ike is jealous of me. He can't stand that I get results while he sits at his desk in Versailles." The diary entry was characteristic Patton, arrogant and probably accurate. Eisenhower was at his headquarters, managing the political and logistical complexity of a multinational coalition. Patton was at the front, winning battles and taking credit. The relationship couldn't survive the transition to peace. As the Third Army drove across Germany in the spring of 1945, Patton's public statements became increasingly problematic. He had always been politically reckless, saying exactly what he thought without considering consequences. During wartime, Eisenhower could control the damage by restricting press access and censoring controversial statements. After Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, that control evaporated. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria, responsible for occupation duties and denazification. He was supposed to remove former Nazi Party members from positions of authority and rebuild German civil society along democratic lines. Patton thought the whole policy was idiotic. He believed the real enemy was the Soviet Union, not defeated Germany. He wanted to keep experienced German administrators in their positions because they were the only people who knew how to run the infrastructure. He saw denazification as a political witch hunt that punished competent people for joining a party they'd had little choice about. And Patton, being Patton, said all of this to reporters. At a press conference in September 1945, a journalist asked Patton about his denazification policies. Patton responded, "This Nazi thing is just like a Democratic-Republican election fight." The comparison was breathtaking in its political tone-deafness. Patton had just equated Nazi Party membership with normal American political affiliation. He suggested that being a Nazi was no more significant than being a Democrat or Republican. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. American newspapers ran editorials condemning Patton's statement. Jewish organizations demanded his removal.
Political leaders in Washington called for investigations. Eisenhower read the press reports and knew he had to act. This wasn't about military operations or strategic disagreements. This was about a subordinate making politically unacceptable statements that embarrassed the entire American occupation. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt on September 22, 1945. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower told Patton his Nazi comments were unacceptable. Patton tried to explain what he had meant. He argued that many Germans had joined the Nazi Party for career reasons, not ideological commitment. He said it was impractical to remove everyone who had been a party member. Eisenhower interrupted him. The explanation didn't matter. The political damage was done. Patton needed to issue a retraction and change his policies. Patton refused. He told Eisenhower he was running Bavaria effectively and wouldn't change his approach because of political pressure from Washington. The two men stared at each other across the desk. This was the fundamental confrontation that had been building since Bastogne. Patton believed his combat success gave him the right to speak freely and operate independently. Eisenhower believed the chain of command meant subordinates followed orders and kept their mouths shut. Only one of them could be right. Eisenhower made his decision. On October 2, 1945, he held a press conference announcing that General George S. Patton was being relieved as commander of the Third Army. Patton would be reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper headquarters responsible for writing the history of the European campaign. It was a humiliating demotion. From commanding a combat army of 12 divisions to managing historians and file clerks. Eisenhower framed the decision as routine reorganization now that the war was over. But everyone understood what had really happened. Patton had been fired for insubordination and political recklessness. Patton learned about his removal through official channels, a cold memorandum delivered to his headquarters in Bad Tolz. He read it twice, then crumpled the paper and threw it across his office. His chief of staff found him sitting at his desk an hour later, staring at the wall. Patton said quietly, "After everything I've done, everything I've won for him, this is how it ends." He wasn't wrong about the timing.
10 months after Bastogne, 5 months after leading the Third Army across Germany, Patton was being put out to pasture. The official reason was his Nazi comments. The real reason ran much deeper. Eisenhower had been waiting for an excuse to sideline Patton since the Battle of the Bulge ended. The Nazi controversy simply provided the justification he needed. Patton had become too visible, too successful, too unwilling to accept that his role was to execute Eisenhower's strategy rather than question it. The subordinate who saved Bastogne had made his commander look weak by comparison. That sin couldn't be forgiven. American newspapers covered Patton's removal with mixed reactions. Some editorial boards praised Eisenhower for enforcing discipline and sensitivity about Nazi issues. Others questioned why America's most successful combat general was being punished for political incorrectness, while less accomplished officers kept their commands. The debate revealed a fundamental divide in how Americans viewed Patton. To some, he was a brilliant warrior whose aggressive instincts had won battles and saved lives. To others, he was a dangerous loose cannon whose political recklessness and authoritarian tendencies made him unsuitable for peacetime leadership. Both views were correct. Patton was assigned to the 15th Army headquarters in Bad Nauheim, a spa town 20 miles north of Frankfurt. The headquarters occupied a former German military building. Patton's office was smaller than his personal quarters had been at Third Army. His staff consisted of historians, researchers, and administrative officers. No combat units, no operations to plan, no enemy to fight. Patton spent his days reviewing after-action reports and approving historical narratives written by junior officers. He was 60 years old, and his career was over. He knew it. Everyone knew it. What made the humiliation worse was watching other generals receive recognition for victories Patton believed he had enabled. Eisenhower was being celebrated as the architect of Allied victory in Europe. Montgomery received a promotion to field marshal despite his controversial press conference. Bradley was given command of the Veterans Administration. Even officers who had served under Patton in the Third Army were receiving new assignments and promotions. Patton was writing history. In November 1945, Patton received permission to return to the United States for a brief visit. He arrived in Boston on June 7th aboard a military transport and was greeted by cheering crowds. Over 20,000 people lined the streets as his motorcade drove into the city. They held signs reading, "Welcome home, General Patton," and "Hero of Bastogne." The reception stunned Patton. After months of official disapproval and professional exile, the American public still considered him a hero. He gave a speech at the Boston Public Library where he told the crowd, "It is a great pleasure to be back in the land of the free and the brave, and I'd like to stay." The audience applauded.
Patton continued, "I'm in the doghouse with the military, but I don't care as long as I'm in the penthouse with you." The crowd loved it. Patton's visit continued through Los Angeles and Denver. Everywhere he went, massive crowds turned out to see the general who had relieved Bastogne and driven across Germany. The public adoration made Eisenhower and the War Department nervous. Patton was becoming a political figure, a potential critic of occupation policies and post-war military strategy. His popularity with the American public made him dangerous. If Patton decided to speak out against Eisenhower or the administration, millions of Americans would listen. After 2 weeks, the War Department ordered Patton back to Germany. He returned to Bad Nauheim on December 8, 1945. He told his staff he was bored and restless. He wanted to retire from the Army and return to the United States permanently. He was waiting for official approval to resign his commission. On December 9, 1945, Patton went pheasant hunting with his Chief of Staff, General Hobart Gay. They drove north from Bad Nauheim in Patton's 1938 Cadillac limousine with Patton's driver, Private Horace Woodring, at the wheel. After several hours of hunting, they began the drive back to headquarters around noon. The roads were icy and visibility was poor.
At 11:45 a.m., near the town of Mannheim, the Cadillac collided with a 2.5-ton army truck that turned suddenly across the intersection. The impact wasn't severe. The truck driver and General Gay were uninjured. But Patton, sitting in the back seat, was thrown forward violently. His head struck a metal partition between the front and rear compartments. He collapsed back into his seat and told Gay quietly, "I think I'm paralyzed." He couldn't move his arms or legs. He could barely breathe. Patton was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg. Army doctors examined him and confirmed the devastating diagnosis. Patton had suffered a broken neck and severe spinal cord damage. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He would never walk again. For 12 days, Patton lay in a hospital bed at Heidelberg, his body immobile but his mind fully alert. He received visits from Eisenhower and Bradley. He dictated messages to his wife, Beatrice, who flew from the United States to be with him. He knew he was dying. His body was failing from the complications of immobility. On December 21, 1945, at 5:50 p.m., George S. Patton died of a pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He had survived 2 world wars, dozens of combat operations, and countless close calls with enemy fire. He died in a hospital bed from a traffic accident 2 weeks after returning from a triumphant homecoming tour. The irony was cruel and complete. Patton was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg among the soldiers of the Third Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. His grave is marked by a simple white cross, identical to thousands of others in neat rows across the cemetery. Eisenhower sent an official statement praising Patton's service and expressing condolences to his family. The statement was formal and restrained, noting Patton's outstanding combat leadership without mentioning specific achievements. History has not been kind to Eisenhower's treatment of Patton in 1945. Modern historians recognize that while Patton's political statements were reckless and inappropriate, his removal from Third Army Command was driven as much by personal and political considerations as by legitimate concerns about occupation policy and post-war military strategy. Eisenhower needed to establish his own authority in the post-war period. He couldn't afford to have a subordinate who overshadowed him and questioned his strategic decisions. Patton's Nazi comments provided the excuse, but the decision to remove him had been inevitable since Bastogne. The general who saved the Battle of the Bulge made his commander look weak by succeeding too dramatically. That achievement became Patton's career death sentence. The relationship between Eisenhower and Patton reveals a fundamental tension in military command. Great generals win battles through aggressive action and independent decision-making. But armies require hierarchy, discipline, and subordination to civilian control. Patton was brilliant at combat command because he trusted his instincts and ignored caution. Those same qualities made him impossible to control in peacetime. Eisenhower was an effective supreme commander because he could balance competing interests and maintain political support. Those same qualities made him resent subordinates who outshone him militarily. Neither man was wrong. They simply represented different aspects of military leadership that couldn't coexist in the same command structure once the fighting ended. The final irony is that Patton's removal and death elevated him to legendary status. Had he lived and retired quietly, he would have been remembered as one of several successful American generals in World War II. His forced removal from command and tragic death transformed him into a martyr, a warrior betrayed by cautious bureaucrats. The legend of Patton grew more powerful in death than it had been in life. Books, films, and popular culture portrayed him as the ultimate American warrior, too aggressive and too honest for the political generals who surrounded him. The 1970 film starring George C. Scott cemented Patton's image as a brilliant, flawed genius destroyed by lesser men. Eisenhower, by contrast, had to carry the burden of having fired America's most celebrated combat general just months after victory.
When Eisenhower ran for president in 1952, political opponents occasionally raised questions about his treatment of Patton. Eisenhower's response was always carefully measured.
He praised Patton's combat leadership while defending the necessity of removing him for political insubordination. The answer satisfied most voters, but it never fully resolved the underlying question. Had Eisenhower been protecting proper military discipline, or had he been eliminating a rival who made him look weak? The answer is probably both. What happened at Bastogne mattered more than anyone acknowledged at the time. Patton's relief of the surrounded garrison wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration that aggressive, concentrated action could achieve results that Eisenhower's broad front strategy couldn't match. The German offensive had broken through precisely because Eisenhower had spread Allied forces thin across the entire Western Front. He had prioritized maintaining pressure everywhere over achieving breakthrough anywhere. It was cautious, it was methodical, and it had allowed Hitler to concentrate 29 divisions against weak American positions and achieve complete surprise. Then Patton had shown what the alternative looked like. Concentrate force, move with speed, accept risks, and achieve decisive results. The 90-degree turn and forced march to Bastogne validated everything Patton had been arguing for since North Africa. Give him freedom to operate, and he would win battles faster and more decisively than careful, coordinated broad front advances. Eisenhower couldn't acknowledge that Patton had been right without admitting that his own strategic approach had been wrong. So he praised Patton's tactical execution while maintaining that the overall broad front strategy remained correct. But the soldiers who fought the Battle of the Bulge knew the truth. They had been caught by surprise because they were spread too thin. They had been saved by Patton's concentrated counterattack, not by Eisenhower's strategic coordination. That knowledge created a credibility gap that Eisenhower could never fully close. Montgomery's press conference in January 1945 had almost destroyed the Allied command because it revealed these tensions publicly. Montgomery's arrogance was the immediate problem, but the underlying issue was that both British and American generals were fighting for credit for a battle that Supreme Headquarters had nearly lost. Patton understood the political dynamics perfectly. He wrote to his wife Beatrice in February 1945, "Ike and Brad are both jealous of me because I win battles and they plan them." The statement was characteristically arrogant and contained more than a grain of truth. Eisenhower and Bradley were staff officers who had risen to high command through political skill and organizational ability. Patton was a combat commander who had studied warfare his entire life and practiced it with ruthless effectiveness. They needed him to win battles, and they resented needing him. After the war ended and combat operations ceased, they no longer needed him. That's when they could finally remove him without risking military effectiveness. Patton's Nazi comments in September 1945 were merely the trigger. If he hadn't made those statements, Eisenhower would have found another excuse. The decision to sideline Patton had been made the moment the shooting stopped. What makes the story tragic is that both men were serving their country according to their abilities and understanding. Eisenhower was managing an enormously complex coalition, balancing political pressures from Washington and London and preparing for the post-war occupation of Germany. He couldn't afford to have a loose cannon like Patton making inflammatory statements and undermining occupation policy. Patton was trying to rebuild Bavaria efficiently, using experienced administrators regardless of their former party membership, and warning about the Soviet threat he saw developing in Eastern Europe. He couldn't understand why political correctness mattered more than practical effectiveness. Both men were right from their own perspectives. Both men were also wrong about each other's motivations. Eisenhower didn't remove Patton just because of ego. He removed him because Patton had become a political liability who couldn't be controlled. Patton didn't criticize Eisenhower just because of ego. He criticized him because he genuinely believed aggressive action would have ended the war faster and with fewer casualties. The Battle of the Bulge brought these competing visions of military leadership into direct conflict. Patton's success at Bastogne proved that aggressive action could achieve dramatic results, But it also proved that such action required commanders willing to take risks, make quick decisions, and accept heavy casualties if necessary. Eisenhower's broad front approach had failed to prevent the German offensive, but it had also maintained Allied unity and ensured that no single disaster could destroy the entire advance. Which approach is correct depends on what you value most: speed or security, decisive victory or minimized risk, individual brilliance or institutional coordination. The American military chose Eisenhower's model. After World War II, the Army promoted officers who demonstrated political skills, coalition management ability, and strategic coordination. Officers like Patton, brilliant in combat but politically unreliable, were seen as too dangerous for high command. The choice shaped American military culture for generations. By the time Patton died in December 1945, he had already become a symbol of the warrior leader betrayed by bureaucratic caution. His funeral at the Luxembourg Cemetery drew thousands of soldiers who had served under him in the Third Army. They didn't care about his Nazi comments or his conflicts with Eisenhower. They remembered that he had relieved Bastogne when everyone else said it was impossible. They remembered that he had driven across France and Germany faster than any army in history. They remembered that he had won. Eisenhower sent a wreath to the funeral, but didn't attend personally. He was busy with occupation duties and couldn't take time away from headquarters. The absence was noted by many observers as final confirmation that Eisenhower had never forgiven Patton for overshadowing him. Whether that interpretation was fair or not, it became part of the historical narrative. The tragedy of Patton's career is that his greatest victory contained the seeds of his downfall. When he relieved Bastogne in December 1944, he saved thousands of American lives and turned the Battle of the Bulge into an Allied victory. He also demonstrated that a subordinate general could achieve more through aggressive action than the supreme commander could achieve through cautious coordination. That demonstration made Patton indispensable during wartime and intolerable during peace. Eisenhower needed Patton to win battles, but he also needed to prevent Patton from becoming a rival center of authority. The only solution was to remove Patton from command once the war ended. The Nazi comments provided the excuse. The firing was inevitable. On December 26, 1944, George Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne and achieved one of the most remarkable feats in American military history. On October 2, 1945, 10 months later, Dwight Eisenhower removed Patton from command of the Third Army. On December 21, 1945, Patton died in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, paralyzed from a traffic accident. The three dates define a tragedy in three acts: triumph, betrayal, and death. Patton wanted to be remembered as America's greatest combat general. He wanted his aggressive tactics and decisive victories to validate his entire approach to warfare. He wanted history to record that he had been right about how to fight and win. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about the dangers of insubordination and political recklessness. He wanted Eisenhower to acknowledge that Bastogne proved the value of concentrated, aggressive action over cautious, broad-front advances. Instead, Eisenhower removed him from command and ensured that the historical narrative emphasized Allied coordination and coalition unity rather than individual battlefield brilliance. He wanted to continue serving his country and preparing for what he saw as the inevitable conflict with the Soviet Union. Instead, he died in a hospital bed, paralyzed and powerless, 2 weeks after being celebrated by cheering crowds in American cities. The final irony is that Patton achieved exactly the opposite of what he intended. He wanted to validate aggressive tactics. Instead, his removal validated Eisenhower's cautious approach. He wanted to be remembered as a great general. Instead, he became famous as a martyr. He wanted to serve his country in the coming Cold War. Instead, he died in a traffic accident before that conflict truly began. On December 26, 1944, George Patton relieved Bastogne and became an American hero. That achievement made him too successful, too visible, and too independent for Eisenhower to tolerate once the fighting stopped. Patton's greatest victory became his career death sentence, not because he failed, but because he succeeded too brilliantly and reminded everyone that the subordinate was more decisive than the supreme commander. In war, as in all human endeavors, being right isn't enough. You also have to be politically acceptable. Patton was right about Bastogne, right about aggressive tactics, and right about the Soviet threat. But he was wrong about the most important thing. He believed that winning battles gave him the right to speak freely and operate independently. Eisenhower understood that in a political and military hierarchy, subordinates serve at the pleasure of their commanders, regardless of how many battles they win. Only one of them could be correct about how military command should function. Eisenhower won that argument. Patton died in a hospital bed, removed from command and exiled to a historical research position. But history remembers Bastogne, and when people think of the Battle of the Bulge, they remember Patton's tanks breaking through the German lines, not Eisenhower's coordination from headquarters in Versailles. Sometimes the subordinate gets the glory, even after the superior gets the last word. That's the final irony Patton would have appreciated. On December 21, 1945, the general who saved the Battle of the Bulge died far from the battlefield, destroyed not by enemy action, but by the politics of peace. His career ended because his greatest triumph had made his commander look weak, and sometimes in the military, making your superior look weak is the one unforgivable sin. Even if you save an army, relieve a siege, and achieve the impossible in 72 hours exactly as promised.